In this video, we will be creating the HTML for the About page of the band website. You may notice that it looks ugly now, but remember that HTML is only for the content of the site. Later, we will use CSS to style the page. Let's get started by going over the structure of an HTML element. Most HTML elements are composed of a start tag, an end tag, and some content between these tags. The content inside these tags can either be text or other HTML elements. There are some tags, however, that have no content and thus have no end tag. These are called empty elements. The image tag is an example of an empty element. As you may notice, the image tag has an attribute called source. All HTML elements can have attributes set on them to define certain characteristics of the element, such as the source for an image tag. And that is all there is to an HTML element. We will now jump into the actual coding of the About page for the website and learn about many different types of HTML elements. Hello everybody, welcome to the coding section of this video. As you can see on the left side of my screen, I have Visual Studio Code open with the HTML from the previous video. I also have an images folder containing all of the images that we're going to be used to create the About page of this website. On the right of my screen, you can see the final version of the About page created for a band called The Generics. For you, this band will be completely different, but you should be able to follow the same template that I am using on this right side. In order to get started creating this band page, let's first right-click on our About page and click Open with Live Server. This will allow us to see our changes live as we make them. Now let's go back to the final band page and take a look at the different components of the page. The first thing you may notice is that at the top of the page we have a header. This header contains a navigation with 3 links going to the home page, the store page, and the About page, as well as a title for the band The Generics. There's also a line in between the two separating them. Let me paste in some code that will render this for us. Now let me open this code in the browser. As you can see, we have our navigation links at the top of the page, our title at the bottom, and a horizontal line separating them. Now let me explain how this works. First, all of our content is wrapped with this header tag. This header tag is just a way of telling the browser that this is a header element. It doesn't apply any styling to these elements, it just says this block of code is the header for our page. The next element inside of our page is the nav element. This is very similar to the header element in that it doesn't apply any styling, but it tells the browser that this is the navigation section of our web page. You could have multiple navs throughout your page, but most likely you're going to just have one nav either in the top of your page or on the side of your page. Next, we have the UL element. This stands for unordered list. There are 2 types of lists that you can create in HTML, an OL, which is an ordered list, and a UL, which is an unordered list. In our case, we are using an unordered list, or a UL, because the elements in our list have no particular order to them. Next, we have 3 LI elements. LI elements stand for list item and can only be used inside of a UL or an OL. These denote the actual items of your list, and as you can see on the right, are styled with a bullet point when they're inside of an unordered list, and they are styled with numbers when they're inside of an ordered list. Next, we have an HR element. This element, as you can see, has no closing tag, which means it is an empty element. This HR element supplies us this horizontal line in our page and stands for horizontal rule. Lastly, we have an H1 element. The H1 element is a heading element, and there's 6 different sizes of heading elements. There's the H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. Each one is progressively smaller than the last one, with the H1 being the largest and the H6 being the smallest. Now let's go back to our final version of the web page and look at the next section of code that we have. This is the About section. At the top you can see that we have a header element, which is called About, a grouping of text with an image, and another group of text. Let me paste over some code that will define this section and view this in the browser. As you can see, we have that About heading, a grouping of text, our image, and another grouping of text. On the left here we can view the actual code and break it down. The first thing you'll notice is that we have a section element that wraps all of the other code in this section. The section element is very similar to a header element in that it implies this is a grouping of stuff that is all inside of one section. While the header element says this is the header of our page, the section element says this is just a generic section of some form in which all of the content is related. Next, we have an h2 element for the about header. This is very similar to our h1 header, except for that an h2 header is always going to be smaller than an h1 header because h1 is the largest header, h6 is the smallest as you remember, so h2 is just one step below an h1. And as you can see on the right here, our h1 for the generics is larger than our h2 for about. Next, we have a p element, also known as a paragraph element. A paragraph element defines a grouping of text that is usually long-form, paragraph-form text with many sentences, and it is much smaller font than our headings. Next, we have an image tag. The image tag, as you can see, is an empty element and has no end tag. It also has this source attribute that we talked about earlier. The source attribute defines the path to the image to be displayed on the page in relation to the actual page you're on. So as you can see, we are in this about.html page, and in the images folder we have an image called bandmembers.png. So in order to get this image, we go into the images folder and then get the image bandmembers.png. This must be a path related to the about.html file. So if we moved this about.html file into our images folder, for example, then this path would have to be bandmembers.png as opposed to images/bandmembers.png. And if we reopen this in live server, you'll see that this now works. Let's move that back to where it was though. And then make this images/bandmembers.png and open it in live server again. And there we go, the image works now. And lastly, we have another paragraph element with another section of text. Now let's go back to our final page and look at the last element that we have, the footer element. As you can see in the footer, we have the generics heading as well as a YouTube image, a Spotify image, and a Facebook image. Let me paste over some code that will define this in HTML and view this in the browser. As you can see, we have that heading as well as our 3 images. If we go over and look at the actual HTML code, you'll notice that almost all of the elements are something that we've already used before. The footer element, just like the header and section element, defines a grouping of text and HTML that is going to be in the footer of the page, which is almost always going to be at the very bottom of your page. We then have our h3 element, which just like the h2 and h1 is a large text heading for the page, and it is going to be smaller than the h2 element. We then have another unordered list with 3 list items in it, and each one has an image which links to the Facebook logo, Spotify logo, and YouTube logo in our images folder. And that's all there is to creating the HTML for this about page. As you may notice, our actual final page looks very different than what our current page looks like, but that is because this final page is styled using CSS. As you remember from earlier videos, HTML is only used to define the content of the page, and this right here is all of the content that goes onto our page. The styling for the fonts, font size, background colors, and all these images, that'll all come later in CSS. All of the content though, the HTML, is complete for this about page. Some common problems that you may run into as you create the HTML for your own band about page is that you forget to include the ending tag for your HTML elements. If you do this, your HTML will not look correct, or it may not even render at all. In order to check that you have created all of the ending tags for your HTML elements, if you click on either the start tag or the end tag, Visual Studio Code will automatically highlight the ending tag for you, or the start tag if you'd selected the ending tag. This is an easy way to check if you have actually created the ending tags and starting tags for all of your elements. Another common problem is with your images not displaying. In order to get around this problem, make sure that the path for your image is in relation to your actual HTML page that it is on. For example, our About page is in the same folder as the Images folder, so we must first navigate through the Images folder to get to the images inside of it. If you run HTML for this page, let me know down in the comments below. Also, let me know which musician or band you decided to use for this project. All of the to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Thank you very much for watching. Into more HTML elements as we build the homepage of the band website, and by the end of this video we'll have created all of the HTML needed for the homepage of our website. Before we get started coding, let's cover a few of the concepts that we will be utilizing, starting with HTML elements. If you have ever tried to use a greater than or less than sign in the text of your HTML, you may notice that it does not render and actually messes with your entire page rendering. This is because these symbols, along with many more, are special symbols that are used in HTML for signifying start and end tags. In order to render these symbols, we must use HTML entities. An HTML entity is written by writing an ampersand and pound sign followed by the number that corresponds to the symbol. For example, this is the code that will render the less than symbol. Remembering which numbers correspond to which symbols can be quite difficult though. This is why the most common symbols, such as the less than sign, have a name that can be used instead of the number. This is the code for the less than symbol using the name as opposed to the number. When you use the name of the symbol instead of the number, make sure that you do not include the pound sign after the ampersand. The next major concept is the idea of meaningless elements. So far, we have only learned about elements that have inherent meaning. For example, the header element is used to wrap the header of a page, the nav element is for the navigation section, and the h1 element is for a heading. HTML has many elements that have specific meaning, but sometimes a section of your page does not have any special meaning, or there is no HTML that conveys the meaning you want. This is where meaningless elements come in. There are two different meaningless elements, div and span. These elements are the same in every way, except that the div element is a block element, meaning that it will appear on a separate line from the content around it, similar to the paragraph tag. The span element, on the other hand, is an inline element and thus appears in line with the content around it. If this does not make sense yet, the differences between these two elements will become apparent as we write the HTML for this lesson. Essentially, all you need to know about meaningless elements is that they should be used anytime you need to group together HTML that either has no meaning or there is no HTML tag to describe the meaning. Now that we got that out of the way, let's jump into the coding of the homepage for the band website. Hello everybody, welcome to the coding section of this video. As you can see on the left, I have Visual Studio Code open with the project we left off in the last video, and on the right, I have the final version of the band homepage. To get started, we should copy the about.html page and rename it to index.html. This is because the about page shares the same header and the same footer as our home page. We now can get rid of the section in the middle that contains the about content since we will not need that on the home page. The reason that we named this page index.html is because the index page is the page that is shown when you leave nothing after the website URL. So if we remove this /index.html and hit enter, you'll see that it renders the exact same thing that is inside the index.html. And if we change this, save it, you'll see it shows up there. Now let's get started with the actual content of this page. Let's jump back to the image that we have to use as a reference and get started with the header. As you can see, inside the header we have an additional button for get our latest album and another button for the play button. To create these elements, we'll use the button element. The button element will render a button on the page as we can see here, and if we give it some text, such as what is on this page, get our latest album, you'll see that it renders a button that we can click on our page. Let's do the same exact thing for the play button. Now we can't actually just show this image with a normal button key press. We have to use an HTML entity that we talked about earlier. The code for this entity is as follows. This will render the play button as we can see here. As you may notice, our two buttons on this same line as opposed to on different lines like they are in this image. This is because the button is an inline element as opposed to a block element. In order to get around this problem, we can use a tag called the line break tag, which is the BR tag. The BR tag adds a line break wherever it is, so if we put it after this button, it'll create a line break right here before the next button. And if we save that, on the right you can see that they are on separate lines. Now we want a little bit more spacing than this between our elements, so we'll use another line break element in order to create a little bit of a gap between our two buttons. That is all the HTML that we're going to need for the header section. But as you can see in this homepage view, that there is a giant background image that is applied for the entire header. In order to remind us that we need to create this background image and find it later, let's add a comment into the code. To do this, use an exclamation point followed by 2 dashes, which will create a comment in the code. Comments do not actually render any information on the HTML page, but they show up in the code so that you can remind yourself or other people that use this code what certain things mean or what to do. So for example, let's create just a to-do comment that tells us that we need to find a suitable background image. There we go. So now if we go back to our page, you can see that that does not actually render, but it shows up in the code for us to reference later. Now let's go on to the middle section of our page. In the middle section of our page, we will use a section element just as we did for the about section of our code to wrap all of this stuff in our tours section. And you can see that we have a header called tours just like we had in the about section. So let's create an h2 and add the text tours into that and view that to make sure that that shows up correctly. Next, we have a few rows that display all of the tour dates for our upcoming tours of the generics band. There is no actual HTML element to denote a row, for example, in this scenario. So what we are going to do is we are going to wrap our entire set of rows in a div, which is a meaningless element that we talked about earlier. This will make it a block element so that way these items will not appear on the exact same line as each other. We will then wrap each individual row in a div of its own. So this outside div here is wrapping all of these rows, and then each one of these rows has its own div that will contain just the text inside of it. Now let me add the text inside of the rows. Now as you can see, if we go over to our page, we have the different text rendered for all of the text in the row. But it doesn't quite look right. First off, we need this July 16th date to be bolded. In order to do this in HTML, we will use what's called the strong tag. The strong tag denotes something that is important. In most cases, it means that the text inside of the strong tags will be bolded, but in some scenarios, the text will actually not be bolded. For example, if you're using a screen reader, if you are blind, the text will have special emphasis when it speaks it back to you because you cannot actually see bold versus non-bold. Let's put our July 16th inside of that strong tag, save it, and go back to our browser to see that that is actually bolded now. Next, we have the text for Detroit and the text for the actual place that the performance is in. Let's wrap these in span tags. Span tags are the other meaningless element that we talked about, and this denotes an inline element. If we go to our rendered version of our page, you can see that these elements do not break the lines as these block elements from the div do. If we were to change this to be a div, you can see that now it breaks both on the top and the bottom of the line. Let's change that back to a span. Lastly, we need to create the button for our final element. Let's wrap this buy tickets text inside of a button element. Now if we go back to our page, we can see that that is now a clickable button. One more thing to note about these buttons is that they can have a type to them, which is an HTML attribute. In this case, you can have the type of button, menu, reset, or submit. In our case, since this is just a generic button, we want to use the button type. Let's copy that and paste that into our other buttons as well, since they are also generic buttons. Lastly, we need to add an HR element that we talked about in the previous video to the end of our row because we have this underline here that we want to incorporate. Now if we go back, we can see that we have this underline under our row. You may notice though that the text is very close together with almost no spacing between them. You may think that in order to fix this, you can add a bunch of spaces after your text, and if you save that, you would think that a bunch of spaces would show up after this. But if you save it, you see that that does not happen. HTML actually removes all of the extra spaces after any element, whether it's a space, a tab, even if you put an enter new line in here and save it, it'll remove all of those at the end of your element. In order to get around this and actually include some space in between our elements, we're going to use temporary, the less than, and greater than symbols that we talked about earlier with the HTML entities. Let's go after our strong tag here and write the code for less than and the code for greater than. Now you can see that we have a little bit of a space between our text. Let's copy and paste this in between all of the different elements of the row. And now there's a little bit of spacing so that it's easier to see which element is which. The last thing that we need to do in order to get our page to be exactly the same as this is copy this row and create all of the text needed for the rest of these rows. I'm going to do that real quick now. We now have all of the code that we need for these sections. If we go back to this page, we can see that all of our rows are now being rendered, and they all look correct, except you see that we have this additional underline on the last row. So go back to our code and remove that final HR element. Now we have exactly the same HTML that we have on this page. Last thing we should do is delete this placeholder text that we added in here at the beginning, and now we are perfect. The only thing left to do is to add some elements to the head. As you can see at the top, this title of our page just shows the URL of the page that we are on. If we want to change that, we can use a title element in the head section of our HTML. This will actually not show up anywhere on the body of our page, but it will be used by the browser to set the title of our page on the tab. Let's just set the title to the generics. And if we save, you can see that now it recreates the title of our page. Another common element in the head section is a meta tag. The meta tag has a bunch of different things that we can define for it based on what we set for the name attribute, but in our case we want to set the description of our page. This description is used by the browser to show a little bit of a description of your page under the title whenever you search in Google, for example, along with other places. For us, let's just set any title, which we set inside of the content section of this tag. Let's just say this is the description, and close off that meta tag. Now as you see, when we save, nothing actually changes on our page because this is inside of the head of our page. If we were to upload this page to the internet and do a Google search for it, you'll see that this description will show up underneath of the title of our page inside of the Google browser results. Now let's go to our About page and do the exact same thing inside of the head. Just paste this in here, change the title from the generics to the generics About, and we can keep the description exactly the same. That's all that there is to creating the HTML for our index page. Congratulations! You know almost everything you need to know about HTML. In the next video, we will cover the final components of HTML and create the last page of the band website. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content, and let me know down in the comments what made you want to learn web development. And one more crucial HTML element as we build the store page of the band website. By the end of this video, we'll have created all of the HTML that we need for the entire project. Before we get started coding, we need to cover one of the most important and most common HTML elements, the anchor tag. The anchor tag, also known as the A tag, is the HTML element that allows us to add links to our web pages. The structure of the anchor tag is very similar to that of an image tag, but instead of specifying a source attribute for an image, an anchor tag uses an href attribute, which stands for hypertext reference. The href attribute works exactly like the source attribute when trying to find the file you specified. This means that the href attribute value should be relative to the HTML file that the anchor tag is in. For example, if you had a file called page.html in the same folder as the HTML file with the anchor tag, then you would use page.html as the href of the anchor tag to link to page.html. Another use of the href tag is to link to other web pages by their URL. This also works exactly the same as the source attribute of the image tag. If you want to create a link to Google, then you would create an anchor tag and set the href to Google's URL. This URL must be the full URL of the website, which includes HTTP at the beginning. In order for an anchor tag to work, the href attribute must be defined. Another common attribute, the target attribute, on the other hand, is optional. The target attribute specifies where the link should open. By default, the value of the target attribute is self, which means the link should open in the current browser tab. The only other value for the target attribute is blank. That means that the link opens in a separate tab. Don't forget to make sure you include the underscore in the front of the self and blank target attribute values, or they will not work. We will cover both target types in the coding section of this video, so if this does not make sense yet, it will become obvious in a bit. Now that we got that out of the way, let's jump into the coding of the store page for the band website. Hello everybody, welcome to the coding section of this video. As you can see, on the left I have Visual Studio Code open with the project from the last video that we left off on. The only difference is that inside the images folder, I've added all the images that we're going to need to create the store page of the band website. On the right of my screen, I have a picture of the store web page pulled up so we can use this as a reference to create the HTML for the band page. Let's get started by copying the about.html page and renaming it to store.html. This is because our store page and our about page both share the same header and the same footer. Now let's delete the content in the center about the About page that we do not actually need in the Store page. What we do need is we need to create a section for the music, a section for merch, and a section for cart. Let's do that. Inside of each of these sections, we're also going to have a header for the title of music, merch, and cart. Now let's take a look at the content inside of each of these sections. As you can see, the music and merch section both share the same template for its content, where it has an album or t-shirt or coffee cup, whatever is being sold, a picture of that, the price of it, and then a button to add it to the cart. So let's create these elements. What we're going to want to do, we're going to want to wrap this entire element inside of a div element, so that way we know it is one contained content. Inside of that div, we're going to want to have a div for the album name. This is because we want this to be on its own line, so we can't just use a span. And inside of that div, since this is bolded, we'll use a strong tag to put the title of album 1. Next, we're going to want to add the image tag, and it's going to have a source attribute, which in our case is going to be images/album1.png. And lastly, we need to add a final div that's going to wrap both the price and button for adding to cart. We're going to put the price inside of a span, and then we're going to add the button for add to cart, and make sure to add the role of button, since this is just a generic button. Now let's open that up using Live Server to see what our changes look like. As you can see, we have the album name, picture of the album, and then the line containing the price, and the button to add to cart. The only thing left to do now is to copy this and paste it down 4 times so that we have a section like this for all of the albums that we are selling in the music section of our store. I'm going to do that now. Now if we open that up, we can see that we have our 4 different albums being displayed with the title at the top, picture in the middle, and price and button at the bottom. You may notice, however, though, that they are all on an individual line as opposed to being side by side as they are in this image. This is because we are wrapping all of them inside of a div, and divs break the line as we talked about earlier. Later we are going to fix this in the CSS portion of our course, but for now we will just keep it like this because, as you remember, HTML is only for content, and CSS is where we talk about layout and display. Now if we go back to the image of our store page, we can see that in the merch section we have almost the exact same layout that we do inside of the music section of our store. So I'm just going to copy one of the templates from the music section, paste it into the merch section, and change it accordingly. Now if we go view this, you'll see that these also show up at the bottom inside of the merch section. The last thing that we have to look at is the cart section of our store. This is slightly different than the rest of our sections and includes a few new elements that we haven't talked about yet. Let's first get started by creating the header row of item, price, and quantity. To do this, we will wrap all 3 of these in a div so that they appear on the same line, and we will use strong tags to wrap all the content because it is bolded. Now if we go take a look at that, we'll see that we have item, price, and quantity all displayed on the same line, but we will use the same spacing trick that we used in the last video in order to show the space between these because right now it is difficult to read. So in our code we're going to add a less than and a greater than sign. This will add a little bit of spacing between our elements. We'll just copy this one more time so it's between price and quantity as well. Next we are going to work on adding in each of the individual rows of this section. We'll do this by using another div tag to wrap the entire row, followed by an image tag to store the image for the first item. We'll use the source to be album 1, as we talked about earlier, and close that, and we will go look at it, and we'll see that this image is way too large. We want this image to be much smaller. In order to do that, we can set a width and height property on the actual image element itself. This attribute we're going to set to 100, which will stand for 100 pixels. If we leave off the height element, it'll automatically adjust the height to be in aspect ratio with the width. So if we had an image that was 200 pixels by 400 pixels, so 200 pixels wide, 400 pixels tall, and we set the width to 100, the new height would be 200, which would automatically be set. If we, however, set both the height and the width, it'll automatically set both those for us to be 100 and 100. Next, we're going to want to add the name of the actual item inside of a span. We will just call this t-shirt. And then we'll want to add in the price inside of a span as well. And between those, we're going to want to use the less than and greater than signs that we talked about for our spacing. Now if we view that, we'll see that we have the name of the item followed by the price of the item. Next, we need to add in this input that allows users to select the quantity of item that they want, where they can type in any number that they want in here. In order to do this, we're going to use an input element. An input element is an empty element that allows us to create an input of various different types. In this case, we're using a number input, so we'll set the type equal to number. There are many different types of input that you can create, but the most common types are a number input and a text input. We will then close that off, and if we go back to our page, we'll see that we have an input in here that allows us to enter only numbers into it. We cannot enter anything that is not a number, just numbers. But in our example, you can see that we have this pre-populated with a 1. In order to do this, we will set the value property. The value property corresponds to the value of the actual input element, and as we change it, as we type in different numbers into the input, this value will automatically adjust to be the same as whatever number we typed in here. So over here, let's just put the value of 1 because that is what is in our picture here. I'm also going to use the same spacing tricks that we talked about with the less than and greater sign to add a space between this price and the input. And lastly, we need to add in a button. This button will have the role of button because it is a generic button, and inside of it we will just put the text remove. Now if we go back to our page, we can see that we have all of the elements here that we have in our image over here. Now let's copy this div one time and fill it in with the information from the second row down here. Now if we go back, we can see that we have the correct information here. I also changed this first image to be the shirt image because I forgot to change that. And as we can see, we have the value of 2 in here, which corresponds to the value of the input element here. Lastly, let's add an HR after all of these in order to put the line at the bottom of the page that we have here before we get to total. The reason I'm not including an HR under these item, price, and quantity views is because we will add these later with CSS. This is because an HR takes up the entire space that is given, which in our case will be all the way from the far left of our page to the far right of our page with no breaks in between. Now let's add a final div which is going to contain the information for the total and the price. As we can see, the total is emphasized with bold, so we'll use a strong tag and type in total, and then we will have the price inside of a span. Lastly, we want to add this purchase button at the very bottom underneath of everything else. So inside of a div of its own, so that it is on its own line, we'll add in a button with the role of button, and we will give it the text of purchase. And that's all there is to creating this HTML here. And as we can see, if we look over here, we have all of the elements that we have on this page created in HTML here. The last thing we have left to do is add in links so that we can navigate with the home, store, and about buttons that we have up here. In order to do that, let's scroll up to the very top and wrap this text inside of an A tag, as we talked about earlier, so that now our text is a link. But in order for this link to work, we need the href that we talked about earlier. Since our store page is in the same page as our index page, which is our home page, all we need to type in is index.html, and now when we save this, we'll have a link here that when we click on it will bring us to the index.html page. Now let's go back to the store page and do this for all of our different links. Now you can see that we have buttons for the home page, store page, and the about page, and when clicked on, they'll bring us to the different pages. At the very bottom, you'll notice that we also have buttons for YouTube, Spotify, and Facebook. So now we need to add anchor tags wrapped around this. But as you can see, there's no text for us to wrap around. All there is this image tag. But that is okay. We can wrap this image tag inside of an anchor tag and it'll work as a button. In order to do this, create the anchor tag, give it a href, which in this case is going to be the URL of YouTube, which is https://youtube.com. And then we will put the image tag inside of this A tag. Now when we save that, if we hover over YouTube, we can see that as a button, and if we click it, it'll bring us to youtube.com. Let's do the same thing for Spotify and Facebook. Now if we save that, we can see that the YouTube link, Spotify link, and Facebook link are all working. As you can see, if we click here, we go to the Spotify website, and so on. But one problem is that when we click these links, it'll override the tab that we're in, and we don't want that for these bottom links. So we're going to use the target attribute on our href, and we're going to set it to _blank. I'm going to copy this over to all the rest of our links. And now when we click on a link for Spotify, for example, it'll open in a new tab while keeping the tab for our original page. Now, all we need to do is copy these new links that we created over to our home and our about page, and our HTML will be completely finished for the entire website. And there we go. Now if we go to any of these pages, you'll see that we have links that work on all of our pages. One last thing that I forgot to mention is that in our store page, we want to change the title of our page from the generics about to the generics store. And there we go. That is all the HTML that we need for this entire project. In our next set of videos, we'll be covering CSS. CSS is what is going to allow us to take this boring, bland looking HTML and converting it over to this beautiful looking mockup that we have over here. After we're done with the CSS for all of our pages, we're then going to jump into JavaScript, which will allow us to make our store page interactive. This will make it so the add cart button actually adds elements to the cart down here, the remove element actually removes them, and changing the numbers inside of the quantity will actually update the total. And that is all there is to HTML. While we have covered many HTML elements, there are still many more HTML elements that we have not covered. I have only selected the most important and useful HTML elements to cover in this introductory course because many of the HTML elements are either obsolete or only useful in very specific scenarios. Even I do not know all the HTML elements, and you should not know them all either. If there is, however, any HTML elements or concepts that you feel I have missed, please let me know down in the comments below, and I'll be sure to cover them in future videos. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content. Thanks for watching.